So let's talk about where HTML5 came from. HTML was first invented by Tim Berners-Lee in 1990, and it's essentially undergone about 20 years of evolution. That's a long time for a technology to still be around, still be relevant, and be growing. So it's certainly the exception when you look at numerous technologies that are out there. HTML rapidly iterated after Tim's introduction through various different stages. HTML 2.0 was a draft that actually went to the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force. The W3C continued to add and iterate upon HTML with HTML version 3. This was during the height of the browser war, when Microsoft Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator were each innovating in their own different ways. And W3C was trying to corral everybody in one room and say, hey, let's all cooperate and build one HTML for the web. And HTML 3.2 was the result of a lot of that kind of discussion. It was really where we started to see convergence of HTML across different browsers, implementations, and the specifications. This was a really great time for web developers because you could start writing HTML that worked in every browser. The evolution of HTML continued. With HTML4, there were new capabilities of forms and tables introduced, not for layout, but rich semantic tables, data tables, multidimensional tables that you could use to express all kinds of data. And the forms in HTML4 were greatly improved over previous forms. In addition, perhaps the biggest change in HTML in its history to date, at least until then, CSS was deeply integrated into HTML in HTML4. And that really started off a lot of revolutions. HTML4 continued to be revised and updated until HTML 4.01. And this is really where it stayed for quite some time. Meanwhile, literally as HTML4 and 401 were being wrapped up, W3C was developing XML, stands for Extensible Markup Language. The idea was that XML would solve two problems that HTML had always had. The first was that web developers and web authors were really sloppy and messy with their HTML, created all this bad markup, posted it on the web, and it made it really hard to build web browsers and other web user agents, is what they're called. XML was designed from the beginning to be clean, 100% valid, and require validity, so that even if a single error was in your page, the page would have to stop processing at that point, at the point of the error. So it was going to usher in a whole new era of clean markup. In addition, the second advantage that XML was going to bring us was that HTML had a limited set of tags. So for those of you that like to author richly semantic markup, you know that all you had to work with was a very limited set of what was in HTML. XML allowed anyone to make up their own tags. And so we could potentially make up tags for everything on the planet. And while this seemed like a boon at the time, it turns out not everyone is an informatician or a taxonomist who really understands how to create a new language. I mean, when was the last time you created a new language? Or anyone you know? I would say almost never. Even other attempts at creating new languages like, say, Esperanto by experts in the field haven't really succeeded very well. So XML was developed, and then a version of HTML forked off from the HTML4 development called XHTML1 that was HTML4 but reformulated in XML. So if you think about this, it's like being able to use all the tags you're used to using in HTML, but with XML. Strictness, validity, conventions, all of that. And for a while, this actually proved to be a really good educational tool because it helped bring a lot of web developers away from the presentational-centric HTML 3.2 world and say, okay, now it's time to update to XHTML. And by that we mean XHTML strict, that's compatible with web browsers and uses CSS for styling. This was a really good time in the evolution of the web because web developers started to develop for multiple devices, multiple media, publish more semantic markup, make it more accessible, and it really was when the web flourished. Meanwhile, back at W3C, they kept evolving XHTML and decided that, well, what really needed to happen was the modularization of XHTML into separate modules that other languages could adopt and reuse if they wanted. And that's what XHTML 1.1 is. It's just the same as 1, pretty much just rebuilt out of these modules, and now it requires XML rather than in XHTML 1. It's still permitted serving it as text/HTML, which meant the browsers could understand it. And so this was really where XHTML started to kind of diverge from the web, and we'll see where that ended up. At the same time, the W3C still kept iterating on XHTML 1.0, the compatible version of XHTML, and produced the second edition of that, which was very good. And finally, all the work that was being developed, put at W3C into HTML or XHTML, was put towards XHTML2. And we'll get back to where that went. But that's essentially where W3C's efforts ended up along that path. Meanwhile, back when XHTML was essentially just being tweaked, I mean, this was a number of years as this was happening, a bunch of the folks over at Opera decided to explore, well, what happens if we took some of the forms in HTML4 and extended them a little bit further? And that's where Web Forms 2 specification came out and arrived. And that started to iterate as a specification, first proposed to the W3C, then outside the W3C. Eventually, it got integrated into a specification called Web Apps. Web Apps 1.0 incorporated web forms and was an iteration of HTML4. This, in turn, became what we're now calling HTML5. The lesson to be learned here is that XHTML2, with the path it took with XHTML 1.1 and continuing to sort of follow in the direction of XML and the idea of new vocabularies and being deliberately backward incompatible with XHTML 1.0 or HTML4, diverged from the web. The web did not stop evolving just because W3C decided to clean it up. The web continued to evolve, and it turned out that all these, the folks at Opera, the folks at Apple with Safari, and the folks at Mozilla kept developing their browsers. They weren't going to stop development just because the W3C was pursuing a specific path. So this really came to a head in the year 2004 at what I'm calling the Great Web Semantic Schism. W3C held an event, was called Workshop on Web Applications and Compound Documents. And this workshop was in San Jose, brought together browser representatives, W3C staff, HTML working group folks, CSS working group folks, SVG working group folks, mobile product representatives, other folks like Adobe, essentially a pretty broad plurality of web technology folks. And the wonderful thing is, since W3C does this work out in the open, you can actually go look at the workshop notes for yourself and go see who was there, etc. But what really happened during this workshop was it just happened to bring together the right people, or maybe the people that happened to be the most interested in what was going on at the time, or frustrated perhaps, with the evolution of HTML on the web. And the end result was what I'm calling the Great Web Semantic Schism. And if you look at the minutes of the workshop, you can find that during the closing minutes of the workshop itself, there were these questions asked, these polls taken, that a lot of folks didn't participate in because they were just plain frustrated. However, you look at the very final polls that were taken, is really about HTML and XHTML and how are we going to evolve, or if either one, for the benefit of the web. How should web authors write documents in the future? On the one hand, you had a group of folks who wanted to continue to evolve HTML4, iterate upon it, because that's what made sense for browsers, for web authors, web designers. On the other hand, you had another group of folks that wanted to evolve XHTML, continue the path along, incorporating more and more XML technologies, XHTML2, Xforms, SVG, MathML, because that would lead us to a cleaner, more structured, etc., web that everyone should be doing and using. And what really made this interesting was, on the side that wanted to iterate on HTML4, you had every single browser representative there in unison agreeing that that was the right path to take. And on the other side, pursuing the evolution of XHTML2 and the integration of all these XML technologies, you had mostly W3C staff, representatives of a few mobile companies, and a few other participants that were there for various reasons. This was remarkable because never in the history of W3C had I ever seen all the browser representatives actually agreeing on something, and yet the W3C disagreeing with them, because W3C was in many ways formed to bring these debating, or some people say fighting browser representatives together to a common place to actually find common ground. Well, if the browser vendors had found common ground with the evolution of HTML, but the W3C was going off in a different path, you can only conclude what was going to happen from that. And it's what we call in open source circles a fork. And that's exactly what did happen. A survey was taken, and the results of this survey in the closing minutes of the workshop, all you can see from the minutes is there were 8 for, 11 against, or 8 for, 14 against. But what was really happening was the folks that wanted to iterate on HTML and DOM, it says only 8, but that represents folks from Apple, Opera, Mozilla, Microsoft, and Red Hat. And that's an amazing number of implementers all having to agree on a single path. So despite the fact that they seemed outnumbered, it was clear to everyone in the room that something had changed, that this many implementers had gotten together and found common ground, and that common ground was outside of the direction W3C was taking. So out of this, 2 groups were formed. Microformats.org was formed within about a year to pursue the evolution of HTML by taking the class ID and rel attributes in HTML and adding more semantics using these natural extension points, using valid HTML4 and valid XHTML1 compatibly with existing web designer and developer practices. Another group was formed, the WHAT working group, the Web Hypertext Application Technologies working group, that pursued a far more challenging mission, which was to take HTML4 itself and evolve it and iterate it, adding new features, adding new web forms support. This was started by the browser vendors that happened to be present, most of the browser vendors at least, that happened to be present at that Compound Documents and Web Applications workshop in 2004. So basically for 5 years, we had heated divergence between the directions that the web community was taking, web development and design community was taking with microformats, with the direction that the browser makers were taking with the WHAT working group, and with the W3C. Finally, in 2008 and finally in 2009, the work started to converge. That W3C brought in the WHAT working group work and decided to call it HTML5. So this evolution was really good to see because people could see that, okay, well, at least there's hope for some sort of convergence. In 2009, the W3C finally agreed to stop development on XHTML2 and focus on HTML5. This was a great development for all those of us involved with the development of web standards and websites in general. Because for what this means is that finally we have browser makers, web authors, web developers, invited experts in various fields, and the W3C all working towards the common goal of evolving the web with HTML5. It very much resembles what happened in the late 90s and early 2000s with the cooperation around HTML4 and browser developers implementing that, and CSS as well. And we all remember what happened then was this incredible renaissance of websites and web development techniques that all of us came together and figured out, here's how we can best use HTML4 semantics. Here are some amazing things we can do with CSS. Around that time, CSS Zen Garden came out, etc. Now the same thing is happening with HTML5. So I'm going to teach you a bunch of these basics and new techniques and things to take a look at. What we really need is for all of you to also help participate in the evolution of HTML5, to showcase your brilliant works that you've come up with, that you've implemented with HTML5, to share your techniques, to help the web evolve to the next level.